What was the worst part of having a ton of siblings? As the only daughter with 8 brothers, I had to cook every meal for 10 people because my mother said cooking was how daughters showed love. My parents had 8 boys before they finally got me, so you'd think they'd be excited about finally having a girl. But the day I turned 7, Mom handed me an apron and said my real education was starting. While my brothers played video games and threw footballs around, I was standing on a stool stirring boiling pots. My mom would hover behind me listing all the ways I was already failing while my skin blistered from grease splatters and my back ached from reaching counters too high for a 7-year-old. By 10, my alarm went off at 4 a.m. every day, because breakfast for 11 people took 3 hours minimum when everyone wanted something different. Parker needed eggs over easy but not runny. Josh demanded fresh pancakes, not reheated ones. Ryan wanted bacon crispy. Ben required oatmeal. Isaac only ate French toast cut in triangles. Miles needed everything on separate plates because food couldn't touch. Dylan changed his mind constantly, and baby Micah screamed if his bottles weren't the perfect temperature. My feet would go numb from standing on cold kitchen tiles and my arms shook from lifting heavy pans, but sitting down meant starting over because laziness ruined food according to Mom. The cooking never stopped because after breakfast came packing 9 different lunches with 9 different preferences, then preparing snacks for whoever was home, then making lunch for the brothers who'd forgotten their packed ones, then more snacks, then starting the 4-hour dinner prep, then dessert, then evening snacks, then midnight sandwiches when teenage brothers got hungry. My fingers were permanently stained yellow from peeling endless potatoes and covered in cuts, and I'd fallen asleep standing up so many times that I learned to prop myself against the counter while stirring. By 13, I was missing school constantly because dinner prep started at 2 p.m. My grades tanked, but nobody cared because what did I need education for when my whole life would be standing in front of a stove until I died? My growth was stunted from malnutrition because I only got to eat leftovers if there were any. I'd sneak raw vegetables while chopping and consider it dinner, while my spine curved from hunching over cutting boards for 16 hours a day. The physical damage accumulated fast because burns that never healed properly turned to scars covering my arms, and my hands looked like a 40-year-old old's from the constant hot water and harsh soaps. I developed chronic back pain that made standing agony and sleeping impossible. When I fainted from exhaustion and dehydration, cracking my head on the counter, Mom made me finish dinner with blood dripping into the soup because they needed their meals on time. My brothers saw me as kitchen machinery that existed solely to produce food, and they'd bang on the kitchen door like animals when meals were 5 minutes late. Josh once grabbed my burnt hand and squeezed until I screamed because his steak was overcooked, and Ryan threw a plate at my head when I forgot his extra butter, leaving a scar above my eyebrow. They'd eat directly from pots while I was still cooking, burning my arms with their reaching, and not one of them ever said thank you or offered to help or even acknowledged I was human. At 17, I discovered I'd developed arthritis in my hands from the constant chopping and stirring, and the doctor said I'd need surgery eventually, but my parents refused because who would cook during my recovery? That night, I decided I was done destroying my body for people who saw me as nothing but a food dispenser, so I applied to colleges across the country for anything that would get me away from kitchens forever. When my acceptance letter came for an engineering program with a full scholarship, I thought I'd finally found my escape. I kept the letter hidden and planned my departure carefully, saving tiny amounts from grocery money and hiding them in a tampon box because my brothers would never look there. The night before I planned to leave, I drugged their food with sleeping pills so they'd pass out and I could escape while they slept. But Mom caught me packing and screamed for Dad. They dragged me to the kitchen and Dad held up my acceptance letter while Mom pulled out scissors and cut it into confetti, letting the pieces fall onto the floor I'd mopped 1,000 times. "You think you're leaving?" Dad asked while my brothers stumbled in, groggy but awake enough to watch. "Check your bank account, your ID, your credit cards, because we canceled everything the day you were born knowing this moment would come." I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and found exactly what they'd said because everything was gone. Every account closed, every document reported stolen, every trace of my legal existence erased. Mom smiled while explaining they'd never registered my birth certificate properly, keeping me off the grid so I could never leave because how do you run when you don't technically exist? "You have no identity outside this kitchen," she said, pointing at the sink full of dishes. "You're not even legally a person, just our permanent kitchen help, and we made sure of that 18 years ago when we decided not to file your paperwork." My legs wouldn't move even though the sink was right there waiting. The confetti pieces of my scholarship letter stuck to my wet shoes while my brothers shuffled back to their rooms. Mom pushed past me to grab the mop and Dad locked the front door with 3 different locks I'd never noticed before. I washed dishes until my hands went numb in the cold water, scrubbing the same plate over and over while their words played on repeat in my head. That night after everyone went to bed, I crept to Dylan's room and found his old tablet he'd thrown in the closet months ago, when he got a new one. The battery was almost dead, but I plugged it in behind the washing machine and searched my name on every website I could think of. Nothing came up anywhere, not even old school photos or attendance records that should have been online. The screen showed 0 results for my name paired with our town, our state, even our address. I tried different spellings and checked birth announcement archives from 18 years ago, but found only blank spaces where I should have existed. My hands shook as I cleared the search history and put the tablet back exactly where I found it. The next morning, my alarm went off at 4 a.m. like always, but this time Parker was already standing in my doorway watching. I pulled on my stained clothes and walked to the kitchen where Mom sat at the table with a cup of coffee, her eyes following every move I made. The eggs sizzled in the pan while I felt her stare burning into my back worse than any grease splatter. Parker stayed by the door the whole time I cooked, not saying anything but making sure I knew he was there. After breakfast, I started washing dishes and noticed Dad had installed a new lock on the kitchen window that only opened from the outside. While cleaning that night, I saw some torn pieces of my acceptance letter had fallen behind the trash can. I grabbed them quick and shoved them in my pocket, then later hid them in an old pad wrapper in the bathroom along with Dylan's tablet that I'd snuck back out. The pieces were small, but you could still see the university logo and part of my name typed on official letterhead. Over the next few days, everything changed in ways that made my stomach hurt constantly. New locks appeared on every window, and the keys disappeared into Dad's bedroom where none of us were allowed. Josh started sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked lunch, and Ryan took over the dinner shift, both of them watching me like guards. The car keys that used to hang by the door were gone, and I heard Dad tell Mom he'd hidden them in his gun safe. When grocery day came, I tried to take extra time comparing prices on pasta, reading every label twice and checking expiration dates. Miles showed up 20 minutes later and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. He dragged me to the car without letting me finish shopping, and Mom was waiting at home with her arms crossed. She said I was grounded from shopping alone, and Ben would go with me from now on to make sure I didn't waste time. The next week at the store with Ben breathing down my neck, I went to the bathroom and saw a poster about domestic violence with a hotline number at the bottom. I stared at those 10 digits until they burned into my brain, then spent the rest of the day repeating them while chopping onions and peeling potatoes. That night during dinner cleanup, I waited until everyone was watching TV loud enough to cover any noise. I grabbed Dad's phone from where he'd left it charging and locked myself in the bathroom with the water running full blast. My fingers shook as I dialed the number, and a woman answered on the second ring with a calm voice that made me want to cry. I whispered as fast as I could about being trapped with no identity documents, and she told me to find a trusted adult at the school or go to a medical professional. When I explained I wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone anymore and hadn't been to the school in days, she went quiet for a moment, then asked if I could get to a hospital. The toilet flushed in the hallway bathroom, and I hung up fast, deleting the call history and putting the phone back exactly where I found it. My parents must have sensed something because the next morning Mom announced new rules while I made breakfast. On top of cooking, I now had to clean the entire house every single day, including all 9 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. She handed me a list that covered both sides of the paper with tasks that would take hours to finish. My new wake-up time was 3 a.m. to fit in the cleaning before starting breakfast, and she'd be checking my work with a white glove. That first day of the new schedule, my legs shook so bad from exhaustion that I had to hold onto the counter while stirring oatmeal. Ryan laughed when he saw me swaying and said I looked drunk, but really my body was shutting down from only sleeping 4 hours a night. While everyone ate dinner, I started documenting everything on Dylan's tablet that I kept hidden in the flour container. I took photos of the bruises on my arm from Miles grabbing me, and the burns covering both hands from that morning's bacon grease. Each injury got logged with the date and time written in a notebook I'd found in the trash, creating evidence of what they were doing to me. The camera captured scars I'd forgotten about, and fresh wounds still bleeding through bandages I'd made from paper towels and tape. That same night, after everyone went to bed, I pulled Dylan's tablet from the flour container and started searching for anything about delayed birth certificates while sitting on the bathroom floor with the door locked. The screen's blue light hurt my eyes as I scrolled through government websites that all said the same thing about needing witnesses who knew you as a child, and documents proving you existed like medical records or school enrollment forms. My stomach dropped reading each requirement because how could I get any of that when I couldn't leave the house alone and my parents controlled everything? I bookmarked page after page about identity recovery and legal aid services, but they all needed proof I didn't have and witnesses I couldn't reach. The clock showed 2 a.m. when I finally hid the tablet again and went back to my room where I laid awake making lists in my head of anyone who might remember me existing. The doctor who diagnosed my arthritis 5 years ago might have records, and Mrs. Peterson who taught me in 3rd grade before I stopped going to the school regularly, and maybe the grocery store clerk who always asked about my bruises when I was younger. But reaching any of them seemed impossible when Ben or Miles watched me every second at the store, and I hadn't been to the school in months. 3 days later during breakfast, Mom stood behind Dad's chair while he made an announcement that I was done with school permanently, since I'd never been properly enrolled anyway. "We've told everyone you moved to live with relatives," Mom said while my brothers kept eating. "You'll be staying here where you belong." My hands shook washing dishes while they explained how they'd already called the school to withdraw me, and nobody would be looking for me anymore. That afternoon while making dinner, my knife slipped cutting onions and sliced deep into my palm, blood immediately pouring onto the cutting board and dripping on the floor. I stared at the cut for a second, then pressed harder, making it worse, knowing this would need stitches and might get me to a hospital where someone could help. Mom screamed when she saw the blood pooling on the counter, and Dad grabbed dish towels to wrap around my hand, while Josh ran for the car keys. At the emergency room, my parents stayed close while the triage nurse asked questions. But when it was time to clean and stitch the wound, a nurse named Ania took me back alone, saying hospital policy required privacy for treatment. The second the door closed, I grabbed her arm with my good hand and whispered as fast as I could that I was being held against my will with no identity documents and needed help. She kept cleaning my wound while I explained about having no birth certificate and being trapped, and her face stayed calm, but I saw her jaw tighten when I showed her the old burns on my arms. "How old are you?" she asked quietly, and when I said 18, she nodded and kept working on the stitches. My parents were pacing outside when we came out, and Dad immediately started talking about how I'd been under stress lately, and sometimes said dramatic things for attention. Mom added that I had mental health issues and they were getting me help, speaking in that sweet voice she used with strangers while her eyes warned me to stay quiet. Ania smiled and said I was all set, but when she adjusted the bandage on my hand, I felt her slip something underneath it. The ride home was silent except for Dad saying the hospital bill would come out of my food budget, and Mom listing all the dinners I'd ruined by being careless. Back in my room that night, I carefully peeled back the bandage and found a small folded paper with 2 phone numbers written in tiny handwriting. One said Ania Personal, and the other said Legal Aid Caden, with delayed birth certificate possible, and call when safe written below. I memorized both numbers, then ate the paper, chewing and swallowing every piece because I couldn't risk them finding it. 2 days passed with me cooking and cleaning while the numbers repeated in my head like a song I couldn't stop humming. Then Saturday morning, 2 police officers knocked on our door asking to do a welfare check after receiving a concerned call. My whole family gathered in the living room while the officers looked around, and Mom explained in her fake, concerned voice that I'd been having some mental health struggles, but they were handling it as a family. Dad showed them the clean house and the full refrigerator, and when they asked to speak with me alone, Mom said of course, but stayed close enough to hear everything. "Are you safe here?" the officer asked, and with 8 brothers and 2 parents watching from the doorway, I nodded and said yes. "We heard concerns about you being prevented from leaving," he continued, and Mom jumped in explaining that I'd been making up stories for attention since childhood, and they were working with doctors about my issues. The officers looked at me one more time. I stayed quiet, and they left after giving Mom their card and saying to call if we needed anything. The punishment started before their car even left our driveway. Dad removed my bedroom door while Mom announced new rules including hourly check-ins where I had to present myself wherever she was and confirm I was being good. My shoes got locked in their bedroom closet, and Isaac was assigned to sleep on a mattress across my doorway every night to make sure I didn't try to leave. "You think you're smart?" Mom asked while watching Dad carry my door away. "We've been preparing for this your whole life." That night, trying to sleep with Isaac snoring in my doorway, I remembered the old email account I'd made years ago at the school before everything got really bad. The next afternoon, while Dylan left his tablet on the counter during dinner, I grabbed it and locked myself in the bathroom, typing as fast as I could to my old counselor, Mrs. Matthews, begging for help and explaining everything about having no documents and being trapped. My finger hovered over send for just a second before I pressed it. Then I deleted the email from the sent folder and cleared the browser history before flushing the toilet and going back to serve dessert. She responded within an hour, and I saw it when I snuck the tablet during cleanup. Her message saying she'd been worried about me and would meet me at the school at 6 a.m. before anyone else arrived if I could get there. The next morning at 3 a.m. when my alarm went off for breakfast prep, I started cooking like normal, but my mind raced with plans to get out. At 5:30 when I took out the trash bags, I kept walking past the bins and ran barefoot down the street with gravel cutting into my feet and cold morning air burning my lungs. The school was 2 miles away, and my legs shook from years of standing but never running, but I pushed through the pain and made it to the back entrance where Mrs. Matthews waited with her car running. She gasped when she saw my feet bleeding and the bruises on my arms, then pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of every injury while asking me to lift my sleeves and show my back. Her hands shook as she documented the scars covering my arms and the fresh burns from last night's cooking. Then she grabbed forms from her desk and helped me fill out witness statements about the abuse. She promised she'd file reports with child services and the police and anyone else who would listen. Then she made a call to someone named Caden Gonzalez, who worked at the legal aid office downtown. Caden answered even though it was barely 6 a.m., and Mrs. Matthews put him on speaker while explaining my situation with no birth certificate or legal identity. He said proving my existence was possible but would need affidavits from people who knew me over the years, medical records showing treatment, school records if any existed, and witnesses who could verify my age and identity. He started a file right there on the phone and said we needed evidence of continuous presence in the community, like the grocery store workers who'd seen me shopping for years, or the doctor who treated my arthritis. Mrs. Matthews drove me back toward home but stopped a block away so I could sneak back before anyone noticed, and I slipped through the back door at 6:45 to find Mom standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. Breakfast was late because I'd been gone, and now Parker and Josh were hungry and angry, banging on the table demanding food while Mom grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks. Dad came in and announced new rules starting immediately with head counts every 2 hours, where I had to present myself wherever they were. Brothers stationed at all exits during cooking times. And Ryan would now sleep on a mattress outside my doorless room every night. They'd noticed the missing tablet too, and Dylan had to guard his devices now. But I'd already memorized Caden's number and the hotline number and Mrs. Matthews' email. 3 days later, while I was peeling potatoes, the house phone rang and Mom answered, then handed it to me with suspicious eyes watching. Caden was calling through Mrs. Matthews' phone to explain the delayed birth certificate process, speaking quickly while I pretended it was a wrong number. He said we needed 2 witnesses who knew me as a child, and proof like medical records or school documents and the arthritis diagnosis from when I was 17 could be key if we could get those records from the clinic. Mom snatched the phone away and hung up, but I'd heard enough to know there was hope if I could just gather evidence. That night, while cooking dinner with Isaac watching from the doorway, Mom started yelling about how I'd tried to abandon them and how ungrateful I was after everything they'd done for me. She went on and on about how she never filed my birth certificate because she knew I'd try to leave someday, saying it loud and clear while I stirred the soup. Dylan's tablet was charging on the counter and I reached over to adjust the pot, pressing record on the voice memo app while Mom continued her rant about keeping me off the grid on purpose. The audio captured everything, including her saying she decided 18 years ago not to file my paperwork so I could never escape, and I saved it to the cloud before deleting the local file. 2 nights later, I managed to call the hotline from the bathroom with water running to cover my voice, and they connected me with someone named Kaiden Gonzalez, who ran a local shelter for abuse victims. He explained safety planning with code words where if I could get to any public place and call 911 with the code phrase about needing help with a recipe emergency, dispatch would know to separate me from family immediately and treat it as a domestic violence extraction. We practiced the phrase 3 times until I had it memorized. Then I flushed the toilet and went back to serving dessert. The next evening, Josh demanded steak for dinner and I cooked it exactly how he always wanted it. But he said it was burnt even though it wasn't. He grabbed my head and slammed it against the counter edge so hard my vision went black for a second, and blood dripped from a cut above my ear. I stumbled to the bathroom and took pictures with Dylan's tablet of the blood and the already forming bruise, adding them to the hidden folder with all my other documentation, while my head throbbed and the room spun. Mrs. Matthews had been coordinating with Kaiden about the extraction plan, and when I managed to email her about Josh's attack, she said they were ready whenever I could get access to a phone. The plan was simple, where I'd text or call with the code word, and police would respond for a welfare check, but this time I'd have visible injuries to show, and Mom's recorded admission to play. 3 more days passed with Ryan sleeping across my doorway, and brothers watching me constantly. But then during lunch prep, when everyone was distracted by a game on TV, I grabbed Dylan's tablet from the counter. My hands shook as I typed the code phrase to Mrs. Matthews while stirring pasta with my other hand, then deleted the message and kept cooking like nothing happened. 20 minutes later, a knock came at the door and Dad went to answer, coming back with 2 police officers who said they'd received a concerning call. One of them was named Leo Gonzalez, according to his badge, and he asked to speak with me privately, while the other officer kept my family in the living room. In the kitchen, I showed Leo the fresh bruises from Josh, the cut on my head, the burns on my arms, and then played Mom's recorded admission about never filing my birth certificate. His face went serious as he documented everything with his body camera and phone, then called for backup and an ambulance while my parents started screaming threats from the living room. The paramedics arrived and said I needed hospital evaluation for the head injury, and Leo explained that as an adult being held against my will, I was free to leave with them for medical treatment. My parents tried to block the door, but Leo stood between us while I walked out barefoot with nothing but the clothes I was wearing, leaving behind 18 years of imprisonment. At the hospital, a social worker named Brock Gonzalez met us in the emergency room and started intake paperwork for the shelter, while nurses documented my injuries and ran tests on my head. He explained that as an adult, even without proper documentation, I had rights and could choose where to live, and nobody could force me back to that kitchen ever again. The shelter van pulled up outside a plain brick building with small windows and a heavy metal door that buzzed when Kaiden pressed the intercom. He led me through narrow hallways that smelled like bleach and old carpet, to a tiny room with a single bed, a dresser with 3 drawers, and a lock on the inside of the door. My phone started buzzing non-stop with texts from every number my family had ever used, messages filling the screen faster than I could delete them. Parker called me ungrateful. Josh said he'd find me and drag me back. Ryan sent pictures of the dirty kitchen with threats about what would happen when I returned. Kaiden took the phone from my shaking hands and showed me how to screenshot everything for evidence before blocking each number one by one. He helped me change my email password, delete my social media accounts, and set up a new phone number that only the shelter staff would have. The other women in the common room watched me with tired eyes as Kaiden explained the rules posted on every wall. Lights out at 9, no visitors without approval, mandatory group meetings 3 times a week, chores assigned daily, no drugs or alcohol on the property. My hands shook as I signed the intake forms while other residents heated up canned soup in the shared kitchen that made my stomach turn. That first night, I locked my door and sat on the floor with my back against it for hours, jumping at every footstep in the hallway. Nobody banged on the door at 3 in the morning demanding breakfast. Nobody screamed about eggs being wrong. Nobody threw plates at my head. The silence felt wrong after 18 years of constant demands, and I stayed awake watching the lock, waiting for someone to break it down. Morning came with Kaiden arriving to start the legal paperwork, spreading forms across the shelter's conference room table. He explained we needed to file for an emergency protective order first, then start the delayed birth certificate petition that would take months. The protective order required listing specific incidents, so I wrote about Josh squeezing my burned hand, Ryan throwing the plate, the head injury from 3 days ago. Kaiden said we needed witness statements, so he called Ania at the hospital, who agreed to provide documentation immediately. She faxed over 3 years of emergency room visits with detailed injury reports, photos of burns and bruises, notes about malnutrition and exhaustion. The counselor from the school drove to the shelter with a box of whatever records she could find from when I'd attended sporadically. Attendance sheets from elementary school showed my name, old report cards with teacher comments about me falling asleep in class, vaccination records from the school nurse. Every piece of paper helped prove I existed, even though my parents never filed the birth certificate properly. My family started posting on social media that I was missing and mentally unstable, sharing old photos with captions about their poor sick daughter who needed help. Josh found the shelter's public email and sent messages saying he knew where I was hiding and would come get me soon. Caden printed every threat, saved every screenshot, documented the times and dates in a log he kept locked in his office. 3 days later, Josh's truck appeared in the shelter parking lot, driving slowly past the windows over and over again. The other residents recognized the hunting behavior and pulled me away from the windows while Caden called the police. Josh drove off before they arrived but came back the next morning, then again that afternoon, circling like a shark. Caden made phone calls all day until another shelter 40 minutes away agreed to take me immediately for safety reasons. I packed my 3 changes of clothes and toothbrush into a garbage bag, while the other women kept watch at the windows. The transfer happened at 2 in the morning with me lying flat in the back seat of an unmarked car, while we drove in circles to make sure nobody followed. The new shelter looked exactly like the first one with the same rules, same bleach smell, same tired women in the common room. I tried to get a state ID the next week, taking 3 buses to reach the DMV with my folder of documents. The clerk looked at my papers and shook her head, saying I didn't have enough proof of identity without a birth certificate. Caden met me there and explained about a special process for homeless individuals using shelter verification letters and affidavits. We'd have to go through social services first, get a case number, then return with different forms that might work better. Meanwhile, the counselor kept digging through old school files and found more evidence in forgotten folders. She discovered vaccination records from when I was 6, a permission slip I'd signed for a field trip, standardized test scores with my name printed clearly. None of it was official proof of identity, but each piece helped build the case that I was a real person who'd lived in this town. The protective order hearing came 3 weeks later in a courtroom that smelled like wood polish and fear. My parents showed up in their church clothes looking respectable while I wore donated pants that were too short and a shirt with a small stain. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while Dad sat straight-backed and serious, the picture of concerned parents. I had to stand at the witness stand and describe the abuse while the judge wrote notes, and my parents' lawyer objected to everything. Judge Sterling asked specific questions about dates and times, making me repeat the worst moments in clinical detail. After 2 hours of testimony and reviewing Ania's medical documentation, he granted a temporary protective order for 90 days. He warned that without more evidence, a permanent order would be harder to obtain, and criminal charges were unlikely. My parents had to stay 500 feet away from me, and couldn't contact me directly or through other people. Dad violated the order within a week by parking his truck across from the shelter's main entrance. I called 911 with shaking hands while watching him sit there for 3 hours, just staring at the building. Leo arrived to document the violation, taking photos of the truck and writing up a report about the distance measurements. Dad got a warning but no arrest because he claimed he didn't know that was the shelter and was just resting. The prosecutor said first violations rarely resulted in jail time unless there was direct contact or threats of violence. I learned that protection orders were just paper that couldn't actually stop someone determined to find me. 2 days after Dad's truck warning, Caden called me into his office at the legal aid building with a stack of papers thick as a phone book. He spread everything across his desk while explaining each form for the delayed birth certificate petition, pointing at boxes where Ania and the counselor had signed their affidavits, swearing they knew me and could verify my age. The court clerk stamped our filing that afternoon and handed back a yellow slip with a date circled in red pen 6 weeks away, which felt like years when you're trying to exist without legally existing. That night at the shelter, I used Caden's computer to type an email to the engineering department at my scholarship university, explaining why I couldn't provide transcripts or ID yet, but attaching copies of the court filing and protective order as proof I wasn't making this up. Their response came 3 days later saying they'd hold my spot for 1 full year if I could provide legal identity documents by next August. And while it wasn't perfect, having that deadline gave me something to work toward instead of just floating in legal limbo. The shelter helped me apply for jobs since I needed money for when my time there ran out, and the first place that called was a diner downtown looking for kitchen help. I showed up for my shift wearing borrowed black pants and a shirt that smelled like bleach, but the second I stepped into that kitchen with its sizzling grills and shouting cooks and timers going off every 30 seconds, my whole body started shaking. The manager showed me how to work the fryer while orders piled up on the rail, and someone yelled about needing more bacon, and suddenly I was 7 years old again with Mom screaming about ruined eggs while my skin burned from grease. I tried pushing through for 20 minutes, but when the cook grabbed my wrist to show me proper plating technique, I yanked away so hard I knocked over a whole tray of prepped vegetables and ran out the back door crying and gasping for air. Caden found me sitting on the shelter steps 2 hours later, still shaking, and helped me understand this was trauma response, not weakness, suggesting we look for work that didn't involve kitchens. He drove me to a thrift store the next morning where the manager needed someone to sort donations in the back room, and folding clothes in a quiet space with nobody yelling felt like something I could actually handle, even if minimum wage meant saving would take forever. 3 days into sorting sweaters and hanging jackets, Caden called to warn me that my parents had hired their own lawyer, who'd sent a thick envelope of threats about defamation and false accusations, demanding I return home immediately or face legal consequences for damaging their reputation in the community. Caden typed his response on official legal aid letterhead stating I was his client and all communication should go through him, not directly to me, and seeing my name on real legal documents as someone worth protecting made my throat tight with relief. The shelter required all residents to attend weekly counseling sessions, so Wednesday afternoon I sat in a small office that smelled like vanilla candles, while a therapist explained complex PTSD and how years of trauma create physical responses in the brain that don't just disappear because you're safe now. She taught me breathing exercises to use when flashbacks hit, and grounding techniques like naming 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste to pull myself back to the present instead of drowning in memories. Ryan must have gotten my shelter email somehow because messages started flooding in saying he knew where I was and would drag me home himself if I didn't come back voluntarily, describing in detail what would happen when he found me. I forwarded everything to the prosecutor's office, but they said threats had to be more specific and immediate to warrant charges, though I should keep documenting everything to establish a pattern of harassment for future legal action. Caden needed my medical records from the arthritis diagnosis to strengthen the birth certificate petition, but when he called the clinic, they wouldn't release anything without proper identification, creating another circular problem where I needed ID to get records that would help me get ID. He had to file formal legal requests with the court asking for special permission to access medical files for someone without documentation, which the clerk said would add at least 3 more weeks to the process. Every day felt like fighting through thick mud just to move forward an inch while my family kept trying to drag me backward. But I kept showing up at the thrift store and sorting donations because having somewhere to be that wasn't the shelter helped me feel less like a ghost. After 3 weeks of legal back and forth with the clinic, a manila envelope finally arrived at Caden's office containing 5 years of treatment records, showing arthritis diagnosis at 13, multiple visits for repetitive stress injuries, documented malnutrition, and notes about burns and cuts consistent with kitchen accidents. The dates matched perfectly with my story of when the cooking got worse, when I started missing school, when Mom refused to let me get surgery, creating a medical paper trail that proved I'd existed in this town all those years even without official identity. Using those records plus the shelter's verification letter and the counselor's affidavit, Caden drove me to City Hall where they had a special program for issuing municipal ID cards to homeless residents who couldn't get state identification. The clerk took my photo against a white wall and typed my information into her computer, while I watched my name appear on an official screen for the first time in my life, then handed me a plastic card with my picture, and the city seal that wasn't a driver's license but was the first real proof that I was actually a person who existed in the world. The next morning, Caden called me at the shelter to schedule an appointment with Social Security since getting the municipal ID was just the first step. He explained that Social Security would need all the same documents plus more forms, and we'd probably have to go back 3 or 4 times before they'd process anything. I met him at his office downtown where he had a thick folder with copies of everything we'd collected so far. We walked to the Social Security building 6 blocks away and took a number from the red dispenser by the door. The waiting room was packed with people holding folders just like mine, and the digital display showed we were number 247, while they were only on 189. 3 hours later, when they finally called our number, the clerk looked at our documents and shook her head. She handed us 4 more forms to fill out and said we needed additional proof of continuous residence, which meant getting utility bills or rental agreements from places I'd never officially lived. Caden stayed calm while explaining my situation, but the clerk just kept repeating that rules were rules, and we'd need to come back with everything completed. Walking back to his office, he told me this was normal, and we'd keep trying until something worked. That same week, the court sent a letter saying my delayed birth certificate petition required public notice in the local newspaper for 30 days. Anyone who wanted to object could file paperwork, and we'd have to wait the full month before moving forward. The notice cost $200 that the legal aid office covered, but it meant more waiting and more uncertainty about whether my parents would try to block it. Sure enough, 5 days after the notice appeared, their lawyer sent a message to Caden's office. My parents were offering to forgive everything and welcome me home if I dropped all the legal proceedings and stopped this nonsense. They'd even let me finish high school and get a job in town as long as I came back immediately, and apologized for the trouble I'd caused. Reading their message made my hands shake, but not from fear anymore. I recognized the manipulation for what it was, and told Caden not to respond at all. 2 months had passed in the shelter, and the staff said my time was almost up since they had limits on how long people could stay. Caden found me interviewing for a shared apartment with a woman named Sarah, who'd left her own bad situation 6 months earlier. The apartment was tiny with water stains on the ceiling and bars on the windows, but it had 2 bedrooms and a deadbolt I could control myself. Sarah worked nights at a warehouse so we'd barely see each other, but she understood why I jumped at every noise and didn't ask questions when I checked the locks 5 times before bed. Moving in meant carrying my 3 bags of belongings up 4 flights of stairs to a room with just a mattress on the floor. The kitchen was smaller than the one I'd spent my childhood trapped in, but I could choose to use it or not. Some days I'd make a sandwich, and other days I'd eat cereal straight from the box just because I could. 3 weeks after moving in, another manila envelope arrived at Caden's office. The medical clinic had finally sent all my records from age 13 to 17, showing continuous treatment for arthritis and repetitive stress injuries. The doctor's notes described burns on my arms and hands consistent with kitchen accidents, and mentioned concerns about malnutrition based on my weight and growth patterns. Every date matched the timeline I'd given them, and Caden said this was exactly what we needed to strengthen the birth certificate petition. The second protective order hearing came up faster than expected when Sterling called us in after my dad was caught driving past the thrift store where I worked. He'd violated the temporary order 3 times, and the prosecutor had photos from security cameras showing his car parked across the street for hours. Sterling reviewed all the evidence, including the threatening messages my brothers kept sending and the harassment documentation Caden had been collecting. After 20 minutes of testimony, Sterling extended the protective order for a full year and warned my family that any contact would result in immediate arrest. My first real paycheck from the thrift store was only $312 for 2 weeks of work, but it was mine. I walked to the bank with my municipal ID and opened my first account while the teller explained about minimum balances and monthly fees. Depositing that check felt like the first real proof I could survive on my own, even if it meant eating rice and beans most nights. The scholarship office called Caden since they couldn't reach me directly, and confirmed they'd hold my spot for 1 more year. They suggested I take community college courses that could transfer later, and sent information about resources for first-generation students. The woman on the phone said they understood my situation was unusual, and wanted to help however they could. Using the financial aid office for displaced persons, I enrolled in basic math and English at the community college downtown. The classes started at night so I could keep working at the thrift store during the day. Sitting in that classroom with a notebook and pencil instead of standing at a stove felt impossible and wonderful at the same time. The math professor wrote equations on the board while I took notes like a normal student, even though nothing about my path there had been normal. My family's messages slowed down once they realized I wasn't responding to anything. Ryan still sent threats every few days, and Josh left voicemails at the shelter, but I stopped reading or listening to any of it. They were still out there somewhere, but I was learning to focus on moving forward instead of looking back at what they'd taken from me. 3 weeks later at the courthouse, I sat in the waiting area with my folder of evidence while Caden checked his watch and reviewed our paperwork 1 more time. Sterling Gonzalez called our case number, and we walked into the small hearing room where the court reporter was already typing, and the judge sat behind his tall desk shuffling through documents. I placed my folder on the table and pulled out each piece of evidence we'd collected over the past months. While Sterling examined the medical records from my arthritis diagnosis, the school vaccination forms the counselor had found, and the affidavits from Ania and the counselor stating they knew me and could verify my identity. Sterling asked me basic questions about my birth date and parents' names, while I answered clearly, and watched him write notes on his legal pad. After 40 minutes of reviewing everything, he signed the order granting my delayed birth certificate petition, and told me the official document would arrive in 4 to 6 weeks. I walked out of that courthouse knowing I'd soon be legally real for the first time in my life. The next morning, Caden picked me up early, and we drove to the DMV where I filled out the application for a state ID using the court order as proof of identity. The clerk took my photo and fingerprints while explaining the temporary paper ID would work until the plastic card arrived in 2 weeks. From there, we went straight to the Social Security office where the wait was 3 hours. But I didn't care because I was finally building my legal existence piece by piece. Caden helped me fill out the SS5 form and explained each section while I provided the court order and my new temporary ID as supporting documents. The clerk entered everything into their computer and gave me a receipt saying my Social Security card would arrive within 10 business days at the shelter address. 2 days later, I was shopping for groceries after my shift at the thrift store when I turned down the aisle with kitchen supplies and my whole body locked up. The wall of pots and pans and cooking utensils made my hands start shaking, and my breathing got shallow while memories of burning oil and 16-hour days flooded back. I pressed my back against the opposite shelf and used the grounding technique my therapist taught me, naming 5 things I could see. 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste. My breathing slowed and I walked past the kitchen section without running, choosing recovery over the fear that wanted to control me. The counselor had texted asking to meet for coffee, so I showed up at the cafe near the school wearing my community college sweatshirt instead of the stained aprons she'd always seen me in. She stood up when she saw me, and her eyes got watery as she looked at my clean clothes and the textbooks I was carrying instead of burn cream and bandages. "You look so different," she said while we sat down with our drinks. I showed her my temporary ID and the court order for my birth certificate while explaining about my classes and the job at the thrift store and how I was learning to exist as a real person. She wiped her eyes and told me she'd never stop being proud of what I'd accomplished. 4 weeks after the hearing, I checked the shelter mail and found the envelope from Vital Records with my name printed on the outside. I opened it carefully and pulled out my birth certificate, this official document that proved I existed, and had always existed even when my parents tried to erase me. The paper had raised seals and signatures and my full name typed clearly along with my birth date, and the state seal making it real and legal and mine. Caden met me that afternoon to help with the passport application, since we needed to plan ahead for when I'd return to university. We went to the post office where I filled out the DS-11 form and provided my birth certificate and ID, while the clerk took my photo against the white background. She said the passport would take 6 to 8 weeks, but I could track it online using the confirmation number she gave me. That weekend, I walked through the thrift store during my break and stopped at the kitchen supplies that people had donated. A small pot and a single pan sat on the shelf, both scratched but functional, and I picked them up for $3 total. Back at my shared apartment, I washed them carefully and put water in the pot to make pasta for the first time by choice instead of force. The pasta was just the cheap kind from the dollar store, but I added butter and salt the way I wanted, not the way someone demanded, and ate it sitting at my tiny table instead of standing at a counter. Making food because I was hungry instead of because I'd be beaten for not cooking felt like taking back something that had been stolen from me 18 years ago. I opened my laptop and typed an email to the scholarship committee confirming I would start in the fall semester with all my documentation complete and legal identity established. Within an hour, they replied with orientation materials, class registration information, and welcome messages from various departments that made me cry while reading them alone in my room. They'd attached forms for housing and meal plans and student health insurance, all these normal college things that would have been impossible 6 months ago when I didn't legally exist. 6 months ago, I was trapped in a kitchen with no identity, no documents, no proof I was even a person, just scars on my hands and burns up my arms and a curved spine from years of forced labor. Now I had a birth certificate and a state ID and a social security card and a bank account with my own money, and a job where nobody hit me and classes where I learned things that had nothing to do with cooking, and an apartment where I controlled the locks, and a future that belonged to me, not them. That's the story and the takeaway. Hopefully there's something in there you can actually use. Subscribe so you're ready for the next one.